My name is Rosario Pulgar, and for a long time I believed the uniform I wore represented justice. I was a sergeant in an elite unit, a man trained to hunt monsters in the shadows of Mexico's border towns. My story isn't about heroism, but about a fall, a painful transformation that made me question everything I stood for. It's a dark journey, and sharing it is a burden, but I feel it needs to be told. If you're listening to this, know that it's not easy to relive every step, and your support is what gives me the strength to continue. If we can reach 1,000 subscribers, I'll know I'm not speaking into the void. Comment with where you're listening from, so I can feel that I'm not alone in this darkness. I want to know how far my voice and my lament can reach, and who is willing to hear the raw, naked truth about how a man can lose himself. I came from the bottom, from a neighborhood where the only prospects were to join the crime or fight against it. I chose the second option, believing, with the naivety of a young man, that I could make a difference. The shine of my badge was a beacon of hope for my family, a symbol that it was possible to rise with honor. I remember the pride in my mother's eyes when I graduated, the promise I made to myself to clean up the streets, to protect the innocent. But the reality of the precinct was different. The bureaucracy, the cynicism, and the corruption were like a cancer, eating away at the institution from the inside. Every day I saw the line between us and them become blurrier, more indistinct, and the idealism that drove me began to transform into a silent rage, a frustration that burned in the depths of my soul. In that swamp of disillusionment, there was a single light, my partner Javier. He wasn't just a colleague, he was my brother, the only person I trusted with my eyes closed. Javier still held on to a spark of hope, an obstinate faith that we could beat the system by being better than it. He was my moral compass, the eyes counterpoint to my growing pessimism. Our conversations in the squad car, amidst the tension of patrols, were what kept me sane. He talked about his family, about a future far from the violence, while I just listened, already feeling that such a future was a mirage. The loyalty between us was the only law I still respected, a sacred code in a world where everything was for sale, including honor and justice. The precinct where we worked was a perfect reflection of the rot we were fighting. The peeling walls seemed to sweat the humidity of indifference. The fluorescent lights flickered over desks piled high with cases that would never be solved. The air was heavy, thick, with the smell of old coffee and cynicism. In the hallways, whispers were the true language. Deals were made in closed rooms. Promotions were given for loyalty to corrupt superiors, not for merit. It was a theater of appearances, where we pretended to serve and protect while the real crime bosses operated with the blessing of those who were supposed to arrest them. I felt like an actor in a macabre play, forced to follow a script I despised, smiling at men whose hands were as dirty as those of the traffickers we hunted on the streets. The frustration reached its peak when we arrested a logistics operator for a local cartel, a big fish who could bring down an entire network. We worked for weeks, sleepless, risking our lives to gather the evidence. The arrest was clean, a tactical success. Yet, less than 48 hours later, the man was released. The order came from above, citing a ridiculous procedural error, a fabricated technicality. That night, rage consumed me in a way I had never felt before. I punched the locker room wall until my knuckles bled, not from the physical pain, but from the overwhelming helplessness. Javier tried to calm me down, saying we would try again, but I already knew the truth. We were treading water, fighting a war that our own generals didn't want us to win. Internal conflict became a daily torment. I wore the uniform, but it weighed on me like lead armor, suffocating me. I would look in the mirror and see the eyes of a man who was becoming what he hated most, a cynic. The code of honor I swore to uphold had become a bad joke. How many times did I have to stay silent when I saw a superior receive an envelope? How many times did I have to ignore a tip that clearly came from an informant paid by a rival cartel to eliminate the competition? I was, drowning, and every order I followed was another gulp of filthy water I swallowed. The memory of the idealistic young man I once was haunted me, a ghost accusing me of betrayal with every breath. It was in this climate of mistrust that we received the order for the operation that would change everything. Commander Morales, a man whose ambition was as vast as his lack of scruples, summoned us for a high-risk mission. He spoke with a cold conviction, his small, calculating eyes scanning us without really seeing us. The mission was to raid a warehouse supposedly belonging to an independent cartel, an easy target to generate positive headlines. But something smelled wrong. The details were vague, the tactical support was minimal, and the urgency felt forced. Javier, with his unwavering loyalty, believed it was our chance to prove our worth, but I felt a trap closing in around us. A cold sensation ran down my spine, a dark premonition of what was to come. On the way to the target, the silence inside the squad car was deafening. The radio crackled with standard communications, but the real conversation was happening in the look I exchanged with Javier. He forced a smile, trying to ease the tension, and talked about the barbecue he was planning for the weekend, inviting me to celebrate what he believed would be a victory. I just nodded, unable to share his optimism. I watched the arid border landscape pass by the window, a desert that mirrored the emptiness growing inside me. That would be our last patrol together, our last moment of brotherhood before hell opened up beneath our feet. I didn't know it yet, but my life as Rosario Pulgar, the police officer, was about to end in a brutal and bloody way. When we arrived at the warehouse, the silence was the first anomaly. In operations of this size, there's always movement, lookouts, some sign of life. But there, only the wind howled through the cracks in the corroded metal. We breached the location, moving in tactical formation through piles of crates and abandoned machinery. The darkness was nearly total, cut only by the beams of our flashlights dancing across the walls, revealing shadows that seemed to twist and writhe. Every step echoed in the vast space, amplifying the tension to unbearable levels. Javier was by my side, his breathing controlled, but I could feel his apprehension. There was an unnatural stillness, the calm that precedes the storm. I knew with a visceral certainty that chilled me to the bone that we weren't hunting. We were the bait, and the trap was about to spring, and then hell materialized. Automatic rifle fire tore through the darkness from elevated positions from all sides. It wasn't the desperate shootout of common criminals. It was a coordinated execution, a tactical slaughter. The sound was deafening, a symphony of death that ricocheted off metal and flesh. We were caught in a lethal crossfire with no adequate cover, no escape route. My men were falling around me, their lives snuffed out before they could even understand what hit them. My training made me react, seek cover, return fire, but my mind was elsewhere, processing the scale of the betrayal. They knew exactly where we would be, our every move. We were sent to die, scapegoats in a game whose rules I was only just beginning to tragically and violently understand. In the midst of the chaos, I heard a sound that stopped my world, a groan of pain I would recognize anywhere. Javier. He was down, trying to crawl behind a concrete pillar, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his chest. I ignored the bullets whizzing past my head and dragged myself to him. His eyes met mine, full of pain, surprise, and a terrible understanding. I tried to stop the bleeding, my hands shaking, filthy with my brother's blood. Rosario, he tried to say, but his voice was choked by a gasp. He gripped my arm with what little strength he had left, and in his last breath I saw all the hope he carried extinguish, there on the filthy floor of that slaughterhouse, holding the lifeless body of my only friend. Something inside me broke forever. The shootout ceased as abruptly as it had begun. The assassins retreated into the shadows, their mission accomplished. Minutes later, which felt like an eternity, the sirens wailed, Reinforcements, led personally by Commander Morales, arrived. He walked into the warehouse with a rehearsed expression of shock, but his eyes couldn't hide a glint of satisfaction. That's when I saw it. An almost imperceptible gesture, a nod to one of his trusted lieutenants as he looked over the carnage. In that instant, the pain of my loss crystallized into a cold, razor-sharp certainty. The sabotaged operation, the lack of backup, the professional attack. It all fit. Morales sold us out. He used us to settle a score, to clean up a mess with some cartel, and Javier's life was the price. Outside, wrapped in a thermal blanket that couldn't warm the chill in. My soul, I watched the scene with dead eyes. I saw forensics experts collecting casings, photographers documenting the bodies of my colleagues, and I saw the black bag containing Javier being loaded into a van. Morales, his face a mask of false sorrow, gave a statement to the press, calling my men heroes who fell in the line of duty. Every word that came out of his mouth was an insult to Javier's memory, a spit on his grave. In that moment, the oath I took, the uniform I wore, the law I swore to, uphold, all turned to ash. Rosario Pulgar, the sergeant, died in that warehouse. What was left was just a man with a purpose, a ghost moved by a single feeling: revenge. Justice wouldn't come from a courtroom, it would come from the barrel of my gun. The days following Javier's funeral were a blur of pain and contained rage. Officially, I was on medical leave, the heroic survivor. But in the solitude of my apartment, I planned my desertion. There would be no resignation letter, no goodbyes, just a disappearance. I burned my uniform, watching the fabric that once represented honor twist into ash, just like my soul. I left behind the identity of Rosario Pulgar, and with it, the last particle of the man who believed in the law. From that moment on, I swore to myself, and I swear to you who are listening, that I would not stop until justice, my justice, was done. Every step I took next was for Javier. Subscribing to this channel is more than a click. It's bearing witness to my promise, and giving me the strength so that stories like mine are not forgotten in the silence. My first target was obvious: the supply line of the cartel that Morales protected. For years, I had studied their roots, their security flaws, the weaknesses that the arrogance of power gave them. While they moved with the certainty of impunity, I moved in the shadows, armed with the knowledge that the corrupt system itself had given me. I spent weeks observing, mapping the convoy, timing the shift changes, and identifying the most vulnerable point in the middle of the unforgiving desert. It wasn't just about stealing the shipment, it was about sending a message. I was going to use the tactics and precision they taught me to dismantle them. I would prove that Morales' greatest mistake wasn't betraying the law, but betraying the wrong man. The night of the attack was cold and moonless. With a small team of men who shared my contempt for the system, discarded ex-soldiers and cops, I executed the plan with surgical perfection. We used electromagnetic pulse devices to wipe out the vehicle's communications and electronics, plunging the convoy into chaos and silence. In less than 10 minutes, without a single casualty on our side, we neutralized the guards and seized a cocaine shipment worth millions. There was no fanfare, no glory, just the cold satisfaction of a job well done. I left behind a single bullet casing, the same caliber used by our elite unit, on the hood of the lead car. It was my signature, a direct message for Morales. I am here, and your betrayal will have a price. With the capital from the heist, I began to build my army. News of the audacious attack on an untouchable cartel spread like wildfire through the underworld. Men began to seek me out, not for money, but for a purpose. They were the renegades, the disillusioned, those who had been crushed by the same machine that betrayed me. That's how I met El Silencio. He didn't need many words. A former Special Forces operator, betrayed on a mission in the South and left for dead by the government. His eyes carried the same emptiness as mine, but in them there was also a latent loyalty. waiting for a worthy commander. He didn't ask questions about the plan. He only asked when we would begin. In that moment I found my right-hand man. Our base was established in Las Almas, a labyrinth of alleys and unfinished houses, a neighborhood forgotten by God and the government, the perfect place to become ghosts. We didn't arrive as conquerors, but as an alternative. We offered what the state denied: security, order, and a share of the profits. We cleaned the streets of the petty criminals who exploited the residents, and in return, we gained eyes and ears on every corner. The community's loyalty was won not through fear, but through efficiency. While the police only entered Las Almas to repress, we were there to build. We were creating our own system, with our own rules, and Rosario Pulgar, the ex-sergeant, was becoming the patron of a fiefdom that grew every day. Morales' reaction was exactly as I predicted: furious, but powerless. He couldn't publicly admit that one of his protected shipments had been stolen by a former officer. So he acted in the shadows. He began sending his hunting dogs, squads of corrupt cops, to conduct raids in Las Almas under false pretenses. But they were on my turf now. Every alley, every rooftop was a watchtower for us. Using my knowledge of their tactics, I led them into traps, humiliating them, disarming them, and sending them back to their master with a clear warning not to return. The guerrilla war had begun, and the hunter now understood the mind of the prey better than anyone. While I dealt with the corrupt police, another predator smelled blood in the water. El Martillo, the sadistic cartel boss who dominated the neighboring territories, did not like my rise. He saw my operation not as a threat, but as an offense. For him, power was measured in brutality, and my surgical approach was an insult to his authority. He wasted no time in introducing himself. One morning, we found 3 young men from our neighborhood executed in the public square, their bodies branded with his cartel's mark. The message was clear: this territory had an owner, and he would not tolerate competition. El Martillo wanted to teach me a lesson about fear, but he didn't know that fear was a luxury I could no longer afford. The response had to be immediate and devastating. The strategy and intelligence that defined me would not be enough. El Martillo only understood one language, that of unbridled violence. It was the first time I had to cross a line I swore I would never approach. We tracked the hideout of El Martillo's squad, responsible for the executions. El Silencio and I led the assault. It wasn't a tactical operation, it was an extermination. We left no survivors, and we made sure the scene was even more brutal than the one they left for us. It was my first act as the monster I used to hunt. Looking at the blood on my hands, I felt no remorse, only a frightening calm. I had become the necessary evil to fight a greater one. It was during this period of darkness that Sophia found me. She was an investigative journalist I knew from my days as a cop, one of the few people who still believed in the truth. The rumors of a mysterious protector in Las Almas led her to me. We met in a dusty cafe, a neutral ground. The woman, looking at me from across the table, had the same questioning eyes as always, but now they were filled with fear and disappointment. She didn't see a vigilante. She saw the fall of a man she once admired. Her presence was a mirror, reflecting how far I had gone, how unrecognizable I had become to the world I left behind. "What happened to you, Rosario?" she asked, her voice a mix of accusation and plea. I tried to explain my logic. I spoke of the betrayal, of Javier's death, of the need to fight. Fire with fire. But my words sounded hollow, the excuses of a man trying to justify his atrocities. To her, I had become just another crime boss, spreading violence in the name of a personal vendetta. "You're not bringing justice. You're bringing war to the doorstep of innocent people," she said, and her words hit me harder than any bullet. That conversation opened a crack in my armor of certainty, exposing the conflict I was trying to suppress. Was I saving or destroying everything around me? I ignored the doubts and plunged deeper into the war. My faction grew, and so did our reputation. Every successful strike against El Martillo earned us more territory, more weapons, more men. Every frustrated ambush against Morales's cops strengthened our position in Las Almas. I became a general on an urban battlefield, moving pieces on a bloody chessboard. The adrenaline of combat, the satisfaction of seeing my enemies fall, became an addiction, the only thing that silenced Javier's voice in my head. I was winning, but with every victory I lost a little more of myself, trading my humanity for power. At the top of my new organization, loneliness was my only constant companion. Paranoia became my shadow. I analyzed every face, questioned every word. Trust was a currency I could no longer afford. El Silencio was loyal, but his loyalty was to my strength, not to the man I once was. My lieutenants respected me, but their respect was synonymous with fear. I saw them whispering in corners, and wondered if they were plotting my downfall, just as I had plotted so many others. I had built an empire on the ashes of my former life, but the throne was a cold and isolated place, and the weight of the crown was the weight of every life I had taken. Sometimes, during the long, sleepless nights, I would open an old metal box where I kept my few possessions from the past. Inside it, there was a photo, crumpled and faded, of me and Javier, smiling, younger, still full of hope. Looking at that image was torture. What would the man in the photo say of what I had become? I told myself it was for him, that every violent step was to avenge his death. But deep down, the truth was darker. Revenge had become an excuse for my thirst for power, for the rage that consumed me. The quest for Javier's justice had morphed into a war for control, and I no longer knew how to stop. El Silencio, with his brutal efficiency, became the personification of my darkest will. He never questioned an order, no matter how cruel. Interrogations, executions, intimidation. He handled it all with a disturbing calm. He was the perfect tool, the monster I kept on a leash to spare my own hands from some of the filth. Yet I knew that his every act was an extension of me. Every life he took was on my account. He was the soulless reflection of my own fall, the living proof that to hunt the monsters of the abyss, I had to dive headfirst into it, with no safety rope. I decided it was time to stop reacting and start actively hunting. My focus turned to Morales. I began to dismantle his network of corruption from the inside out. Using drug money, I bought informants within his own department. I exposed his money laundering schemes, sabotaged his political alliances, and intercepted the bribes he received. I wasn't just attacking the cartel he protected. I was destroying the empire he had built on lies and the blood of good men like Javier. The war became personal and strategic, a chess match where every move was calculated to suffocate him slowly, to make him feel the same desperation I had felt. The mounting pressure led El Martillo to make a mistake. Desperate to eliminate me, he planned a direct attack, not on my men, but on me. A bomb was planted in my car. By pure instinct from years of police training that taught me to distrust everything, I noticed an anomaly, a wire out of place. I escaped by seconds. The explosion that was meant to turn me to dust only served to harden my resolve. That act showed that El Martillo's brutality was his greatest weakness. He was predictable, a rabid animal. Morales was the snake, the intelligent enemy, but El Martillo was the mad dog that needed to be put down first, so I could focus on the real threat. My actions in Las Almas turned me into a legendary and controversial figure. To many residents, I was a lesser evil. They saw me as the man who brought order where there was chaos, who punished the rapists and thieves the police ignored. They called me El Protector. They brought me offerings, asked for my blessing, told me about police movements. But to others, especially the families who lost children in the crossfire of my war, I was no different from El Martillo. I was just another drug lord, a warlord who painted his violence with the colors of justice. I lived in this limbo, hailed as a saint by some and cursed as a demon by others. Sophia sought me out again, this time with fury in her eyes. She didn't bring questions, but accusations. In her hands were photos of wounded children, victims of a stray grenade from one of my clashes with El Martillo's cartel. "Look at them, Rosario! Look them in the eyes and tell me your revenge is worth this!" she screamed, her voice choked with pain and anger. The images were knives piercing my conscience. My justification sounded pathetic, even to me. I was so focused on my enemies, on Morales and El Martillo, that I had become blind to the collateral damage, to the innocent lives being destroyed in my path. Rosario Pulgar's war was no longer just mine. It was that night, looking at the photos Sophia left behind, that I made the riskiest decision of my life. I could no longer fight on two fronts, bleeding out civilians in the process. I needed to end this war, and to do that, one of my enemies would have to eliminate the other. My plan was audacious and dangerous, to manipulate Morales and El Martillo into destroying each other in a direct confrontation, while I would wait to annihilate what was left. It's a path of no return, and I know many of you might question this choice. If you've come this far, if you're invested in this story, know that your support, your subscription, helps me to let out this terrible truth. It's proof that someone understands the weight of doing the unthinkable when there are no other options left. The plan began to take shape. I used my informants to leak false information to both sides. To El Martillo, I whispered that Morales planned to betray him and hand him over to federal authorities to clean up his own image. To Morales, I forged evidence that El Martillo was about to expose his entire corruption network to the press, using Sophia as a channel. I planted the seed of mutual distrust, watering it with half-truths and blatant lies. I was setting them on a collision course, using their own natures, the brutality of one and the paranoia of the other, as weapons. I had become a puppet master, and the strings were stained with blood. My own paranoia, however, ended up saving me. I noticed one of my newest recruits acting strangely, asking too many questions about our communication protocols. El Silencio wanted to execute him immediately, but I needed proof. I set a trap, fed him false information about one of my shipments, and watched. Hours later, a police unit under Morales tried to intercept the ghost shipment. The traitor had taken the bait. His execution was public, a cold display of power for the rest of my faction. I felt no pleasure, only the confirmation that loneliness and distrust were the only allies I could truly rely on to keep me alive. With the house cleaned and the pieces of my deadly game in their places, I held the final meeting with my inner circle. On the map spread across the table, I traced the routes Morales and El Martillo would take, leading them to the meeting point I had chosen to be the stage for their mutual destruction, an abandoned industrial yard on the edge of the city. My men were in position, ready to act as the third force, the true predators waiting for the two giants to mortally wound each other. My transformation was complete. The idealistic sergeant who hesitated to break the rules had become a cold, calculating strategist, willing to sacrifice dozens to achieve his goal. I was the architect of an imminent massacre. In the quiet before the battle, as I cleaned my rifle, I found a small keychain at the bottom of my bag. It was a metal angel that Javier used to carry for luck. I had taken it from his belongings on the day of his autopsy and forgotten about it. Holding that cold object in my palm was like a shock, a wave of memories, of laughter in the squad car, of plans for the future washed over me. For a brief moment, the pain overcame the anger. This war was for him, but the man fighting it was someone Javier would barely recognize. I put the angel in my pocket. It wouldn't bring me luck, but it would serve as a reminder of the price I had already paid. Night fell over the city, heavy and expectant. The radio began to crackle with intercepted communications. Morales' forces, believing they were on their way to arrest El Martillo, advanced from the east. El Martillo's sicarios, convinced they were heading into an ambush against the corrupt cops who had betrayed them, moved from the west. They were funneling toward my slaughterhouse. From my vantage point on a distant rooftop, I watched the lights of the convoys approaching, two serpents of steel and fury about to collide. The air vibrated with tension. The curtain was about to rise on the final act of my revenge. The first shot was the spark that ignited the industrial yard. The two factions, shrouded in the fog of disinformation I had created, hesitated for just a second before surrendering to an orgy of violence. From my elevated viewpoint, I watched my plan materialize in flashes of gunfire and screams of agony. The lights of squad cars cut through the darkness, illuminating men who, in other circumstances, might have been allies, now annihilating each other with blind fury. The air filled with the smell of gunpowder and ozone, and the sound of the battle was like a chaotic orchestra, with each rifle burst and each explosion serving as a note in the symphony of my revenge. I was the conductor of that hell, and the performance was just beginning to reach its bloody climax, when the chaos reached its boiling point, with both sides taking significant losses and their command structures shattered. I gave the signal. My men, disciplined and focused, emerged from the shadows like wolves attacking a wounded flock. We didn't engage in the main brawl. We executed our targets with lethal precision, clearing the path to my true objective. While El Silencio led a team to eliminate El Martillo's lieutenants and secure our control of the perimeter, I advanced with my personal escort toward the center of the complex. I moved through the battlefield I had created, a ghost amidst the crossfire, my eyes fixed on the only prize that mattered, the life of Commander Morales. My path, however, was intercepted by the very incarnation of brutality. El Martillo, his face covered in blood and a rifle in his hand, emerged from behind a flaming container. His eyes found mine, and in them was a savage recognition. He didn't need explanations. He knew he had been played. Our confrontation was inevitable, a clash of styles. He was brute force, firing wildly, roaring with hatred. I was precision, moving from cover to cover, using the smoke and chaos to my advantage. The battle around us became a secondary backdrop to the personal duel between the sadistic king of the drug trade and the strategist who dared to challenge his throne. El Martillo's brute force was formidable, but his rage made him predictable. He charged forward, hoping to crush me with firepower, but I lured him into a trap. I forced him back toward a set of industrial gas cylinders that had been pierced by stray bullets. As he reloaded, I fired a single, precise shot at the valve of one of the cylinders. The spark from a nearby grenade was enough. The resulting explosion engulfed him in a fireball, ending his reign of terror in a spectacular and anonymous fashion. I stood for a moment, looking at my enemy's funeral pyre, feeling only the coldness of a problem solved. One monster was down, but my hunt was not yet over. With the path clear, I finally reached the makeshift office from where Morales was commanding his men. The door gave way with a single kick. Inside, the man who was once my all-powerful superior was cowering behind a metal desk, his face pale with terror, the radio in his hand emitting only static. The sound of the battle outside seemed distant, muffled. The universe shrank to fit into that small, dusty room. I closed the door, the click of the lock sounding like the lid of a coffin. He was no longer a commander, nor a cop. He was just a scared man, stripped of his power and his arrogance, facing the ghost he himself had created, who had now come to collect the debt. "Rosario, we can make a deal," he stammered, sweat pouring down his forehead. "Money, roots, whatever you want. We can split everything." His words were poison, a last attempt to corrupt me, to bring me down to his level. I walked slowly toward him, my weapon aimed at his chest. "I don't want your dirty business," I said, my voice a low, controlled growl. "I want you to say his name." He looked at me, confused. "Whose name?" I pressed the barrel of my gun to his head. "The name of the man you sent to his death, my partner. Say his name." The terror in his eyes mixed with realization. He knew there would be no bargain, only a reckoning. "Javier," he whispered, the name leaving his lips like a blasphemy. It was all I needed to hear. The final confession. I looked into his pleading eyes and saw nothing. No trace of remorse, just the abject fear of an animal about to be slaughtered. There was no final speech, no declaration of justice, only the fulfillment of a promise made over a friend's body. The sound of the gunshot was dry, final. Morales's body slumped to the side, lifeless. And in the silence that followed, as the echo of the shot faded, I waited to feel something. Relief, triumph, peace. But nothing came. Absolutely nothing. Just a vast, cold emptiness, deeper than any abyss I had ever known. My revenge was complete, but my soul was in ruins. I walked out of the office and back onto the battlefield. The shooting had stopped, replaced by the groans of the wounded and the silence of the dead. My men moved with a grim efficiency, disarming the survivors and piling up the bodies of our enemies. El Silencio approached, his face as impassive as ever, and just nodded. "It's over, boss. The territory is ours." I looked at the scene of devastation, at the flames still licking the carcasses of the vehicles, and I felt nothing. I was the king of that cemetery, the sovereign of an empire built on corpses. Victory had the bitter taste of the ashes that hung in the air, and the silence that followed Morales's death was more deafening than any explosion. The war was over, but peace did not come. Months passed. I became everything I once swore to destroy. The drug lord, the power behind the shadows, the man everyone feared. From my fortified office, I controlled the routes, the politics, the life and death in the dead city. The money flowed, loyalty was bought, and fear was my primary tool. But the power I had sought to ensure my safety became my prison. Every meal was tasted by someone else. Every night was a vigil against potential traitors. Every friendly face was a mask that could hide an assassin. I had dominated the system, but I became its most solitary prisoner, haunted not by my enemies, but by the ghost of the man I used to be. One night I saw Sophia on television. She was reporting on the new peace that had settled over the city. A peace maintained not by law, but by the monopoly on violence held by a single faction. She spoke of how the chaotic brutality of before had been replaced by an organized and efficient oppression. She didn't say my name, but her eyes, full of a deep sadness, seemed to look directly at me through the screen. In her words, I heard my final verdict. I hadn't cleaned up the city. I had just traded one type of monster for another. To the world, to the one person whose opinion still mattered to me, I was the disease I thought I was curing. I am alone now, in my office at the top of the tallest building, looking out at the lights of the city that bled for me. The lights shine like diamonds scattered on dark velvet, indifferent to what happens on its streets. In my hand, I hold Javier's little metal angel. It no longer seems like a symbol of luck or protection, but a cold piece of lead, the dead weight of a broken promise. I won the war. I avenged. My friend, I built an empire. I have all the power a man could ever want, but I lost the only thing that truly mattered, myself. I am a king on a throne of loneliness, ruling over a kingdom of regrets, forever a prisoner of my own victory. This is my story. I don't tell it to seek forgiveness, for I know there is none for me. I share it as a warning, a map of the path that leads a good man into the abyss. Revenge is a fire that consumes everything, especially the one who wields it. I thank every one of you who listened to the end, who witnessed my fall. If my confession has served any purpose, let it be to show the price of justice when it becomes lost in hatred. Subscribing and supporting this space is the only way to ensure that voices like mine, coming from the darkness, continue to be heard, so that perhaps others do not make the same mistakes. Silence is what allows monsters to thrive, both outside and within.